There we go. Good morning
Good morning.
Hello.
to our second of 5 sessions discussing. Interrupted. Today, we're going to focus on chapters 3 and 4, which are fairly lengthy and detailed. And hopefully, have you had a chance to read those?
Some of it.
Some yes, some no. Okay. And we'll just sort of see where the discussion goes. I did dig out of my files a couple of things which I thought might be helpful. These two, let's see, can you see them? If I get out of the way, maybe folks can see those. Because the one on the right is simply a list of various kinds of biblical criticism. He doesn't go into this detail. He just sort of lumps it all into the historical critical method. But if you break it down into subtypes, these are the kinds of disciplines: form criticism, literary criticism, redaction criticism, structural exegesis, and textual criticism. And those all have to do with looking at, I almost said original text, but that's part of the problem. We don't have any original texts. All we have is copies of copies of copies of copies. So the text criticism is looking at the different manuscripts that we have dug up from somewhere and looking at the places where they're the same and the places where they're different, and trying to second guess whether those differences are simply errors that the scribes made when they were copying, because the guys copying them did not necessarily have the ability to read what they were copying. They were simply making the mark on this paper look like the mark on that paper. And sometimes they got it right, and sometimes they got it wrong. And sometimes the way they got it wrong changes the meaning of the word they were writing. So that's text criticism. Redaction criticism is getting at, redaction is a, and a lot of this comes originally from German scholarship. So Redaktionsgeschichte in German is looking at intentional changes. In other words, if Matthew and Luke are telling essentially the same story, but in Matthew, it's a Sermon on the Mount, and in Luke, it's a Sermon on the Plain. Why the difference? Because of the same story. So why did Luke decide to change Matthew, or did Matthew change Luke? Who knows?
It appeared that there was a Sermon on the Plain and a Sermon on the Mount.
And that's called a harmony. Right. And that's one way to try to get around those thorny issues, which, as he argues, and this kind of work would argue, takes away from the individuality of the author. I mean, it's convenient if we're coming from a standpoint that we have to accept the Bible as wholly true, which then, to quote somebody that you don't normally want to quote, namely Pilate, what is truth? And how many levels of truth are there? Well, beyond the literal, because even in the ancient world, in the 4th century, scholars like Origen of Alexandria knew that there were more levels of truth than just literal truth.
I think my whole life and all the biblical, personal, literary things I read, there has been that harmonizing
Sure.
work.
Yeah.
And this is the first time that I've heard someone say, no, you need to take each author and what their viewpoint is separately. And it's a foreign idea to me, except when I think about current issues going on, like if you read one book about, let's say, politics, and you read another author about politics, and they may be talking about the same event, but they have different agendas, different themes in the book.
Right.
And so there'll be some differences and biases, and so I don't try to harmonize that. So it's
harmony that I suggest is not really apologetic. It's really the fact that preachers who spend 3 years giving sermons give the same sermon sometimes, especially if you give them.
You mean they recycle?
They recycle.
I beg to differ. I never recycle. Well, I mean, well, and this is sort of to that point. No, I'm sorry. I'm quoting something I already quoted. I was looking for it somewhere in there, and I remember marking it. He talks about, he compares these, different views and so-called eyewitness accounts to, if you're a judge in a courtroom and you're listening to different so-called eyewitness testimony, and the testimony doesn't agree. And as a psychologist, we've done studies on those kinds of things, and you're right, because we have filters, and everybody's perception is not objective. It is by definition subjective. And so there's all sorts of problems and filters and unconscious biases and all sorts of other stuff that get in the way of our trying to recollect what we think we saw.
There's a famous play or book, isn't there? I don't know if it's Asian or not, about a trial and they give everybody's point of view. It's all different. All the eyewitnesses. I can't think of the name of it, but
Yeah, that's not ringing a bell in my head, and nor can I find the spot in the book, but I know I saw it yesterday morning.
You think you can judge a marriage by when you come out?
what did she say? We can't hear her.
Yeah. All right. So let me give some background about this stuff, because one of the things that he talks about when he's comparing the variant views between Paul and the Gospels and the dating of the Gospels. And here's where I wish I had another one, which probably is sitting in a file, and I just didn't have time to go through all of them to get them. Let's look at Roman Palestine in the first century. Okay. If based on nothing other than popular mythology, because again, there's nothing in the Gospels that says Jesus was 30 years old when he started preaching. It doesn't say that anywhere. But we have this notion that somewhere when he was an adult, which in the ancient world was a lot younger than it is now because people didn't live as long. If his public ministry is somewhere in the 30s AD, and Paul's writings are in the 40s and 50s AD, and we accept that Mark was the first gospel written somewhere around 70, Matthew and Luke in the 80s, and John probably in the 90s. So that's the first 100 years. Are you guys familiar with what was going on, and in particular, one particular major event that occurred about the middle of that century? Okay, hold that thought. No, let me see if Mike is the only one. Anybody, are you familiar with this history at all?
Jerusalem was destroyed.
Thank you. Yes, in what? Why?
Well, the Romans were a little upset that they had 3,000 troops killed by the Jews. And they took a couple of years to...
Yeah, more than a couple, but yeah.
To reorganize themselves after they had internal divisions.
Okay.
Military divisions.
Right, so we're talking about the first Jewish revolt.
Right.
Because there was a second Jewish revolt in the 120s, the Bar Kokhba revolt. Was that what you were thinking?
No, I was thinking about 70 AD.
Well, yeah, but 70 AD happened because
Right. Of other stuff.
Right. So, and I'm looking at one of the things I like about the Jerusalem Bible is it has this wonderful chronological table at the back. And it goes through all of the stuff. In one column, what was happening in the civil world in terms of who was ruling who and who revolted against who. And you know, who was the Roman emperor at the time. And the other side links it with the supposed dates of the biblical books that are roughly contemporaneous. So we have in 64 AD, Rome burns, and Christians are blamed for it. This is Nero. And we have the Jewish revolt starting at about 66, 67. The temple in Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans in putting down that revolt in 70. So you think Jesus is standing there saying a time is coming when no stone will be left on stone? Mark wrote that about the time that it was true.
Maybe.
Well, yes, I'm going with common scholarship. And the Jews held out on the mountaintop fortress of Masada for another full 4 years, under siege by the Romans, until finally, rather than surrender, they committed mass suicide. And you can go visit that site today. So that was a huge event. As a result of Rome's suppression of that revolt, you basically have, of the 4 major subgroups within Judaism, Sadducees, Pharisees, Zealots, and Essenes, 3 of the 4 are wiped out.
I don't know Essenes.
Essenes are the Qumran community. They were a semi-monastic group that lived apart. And it is thought that that community on the shore of the Dead Sea was responsible for the scrolls that were found in the caves nearby. So we have an insight into what they were like. The Zealots, as the name popularly implies, were the ones who advocated for a military violent rebellion against Rome. And the Sadducees, locus of power, they were the priestly class after the name of Zadok, who was the high priest in the post-exilic period. Their focus was on the temple and the religious stuff that focused on the temple. So once the temple was destroyed, they sort of evaporate. They have nothing to stand on, literally. So the only group that survives this calamity are the Pharisees, because they're the ones that are in charge of all the local synagogues. They're not localized in one spot. And the synagogues keep doing what they've always been doing. So modern Judaism is a descendant of the only group that survived that first revolt, which is Pharisaic Judaism. So in the aftermath of that, as long as the Christians could claim to be Jews, they enjoyed certain protections under Roman law. They were members of religio licita, legal religion, because in Roman law, once they conquered a place, they didn't mess with local customs very much. And sometimes they would let the local ruler stay the ruler. That's why King Herod he was only a king at the pleasure of Caesar. And as long as the people paid their taxes and he didn't foment rebellion, he was allowed to, and so day-to-day life for most people just kept right on, except every once in a while you'd see Roman centurions walking around, keeping the peace, which was a very different policy from, say, the ancient Assyrians, you know, the 10 lost tribes of Israel, because their policy when they conquered a place, and they're the ones that conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BC. Their policy was to treat their empire like an Osterizer blender. And they would remove most of the indigenous, the upper classes of the local population and resettle them in some other place of their empire. Presumably under the theory that if you weren't living in your ancestral homeland, you had less reason to fight and rebel against the empire. We just look at what the Ukrainians are doing right now. They're fighting for their land. It's their ground, and they ain't going to give it up easily. So the Syrian policy was to relocate. And we saw similar things when the Chaldeans conquered the southern kingdom of Judah with a mass deportation of the upper classes to Babylon, the so-called Babylonian exile. So anyway, the Romans didn't do that. They let the local structure, and you could practice your local religion, whatever it was. Again, as long as you paid your taxes and didn't make trouble, they pretty much left you alone. But if you revolt, oh boy, Rome came down with a heavy hand. And that's what happened between 67 and 74 AD. And Jerusalem was pretty much a wasteland. So it took a decade or two for the leaders of Judaism that survived this calamity to sort of get their act together. And they gathered at the coastal town, now known as Joppa. Back then it was Yavneh. And the rabbis got together and said, okay, now what are we going to do? Because they had two problems. One is this national calamity, and the other is these PITA sect of troublemaker, rabble rousers called Christians who follow this Jesus guy, who are causing problems in synagogue after synagogue all over the place. What are we going to do about it? So they did a couple of things. Throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world, if you were more than a local illiterate laborer, workman, today we would call you a tradesperson. If you had any sort of larger business dealings, the common language of commerce was Greek, going back to the time of Alexander's empire and the three empires that succeeded his empire. And therefore, in the synagogues outside of the immediate Palestinian area, they didn't use the Hebrew Bible. How many of you have heard of the Septuagint? I don't want to bore you to death if this is old hat. Okay, so you know about the Septuagint. You know that it has books in it that were not composed in Hebrew, right? And if you pick up a book like this or some other English translations, there'll be the Old Testament, the New Testament, and a section in the middle called the Apocrypha, right? Okay. So that goes back to the days when the rabbis meeting in Yavneh, this is in 90, decide that they're no longer going to use the Greek Bible. It is no longer considered authoritative. You've got to use the Hebrew. And the second thing they did is to declare those people who claim to be followers of Jesus and that this Jesus of Nazareth was a Messiah are no longer Jews. They are anathema. They are outcasts. They are no longer part of us, which means that Christians no longer enjoy any sort of protection under Roman law. They are no longer followers of a religio licita. They are now practitioners of an illegal religion, which makes persecution of them a whole lot easier, and for the Romans, legal. So now you've got these, you think of the kinds of, we've all heard of them, schisms within a congregation, where you got two factions and there's a split and they try to get along and they can't, eventually one group leaves and starts its own church. Oh, well, yeah. Or us a few decades ago, you know, the Anglican Church in North America.
Yeah.
So the same thing happened, except now the Jewish leaders of the local synagogue can go to the Roman governor and point fingers at these people, and they can be arrested and tried after 90 AD. So if you look at the difference, for example, and he talks about this, in who are Jesus' primary antagonists in the three synoptic gospels? Right. And who are they in John's gospel?
The Jews.
The Jews. Right. You know,
David, can you repeat that? We couldn't hear that.
well, I was just about to do that. You no longer have the sort of fine distinctions that you have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, whether Jesus is talking to Sadducees or talking to Pharisees. The ones who accuse Jesus when he's on trial is not this group or that group, but it is simply the Jews. Question: what version of the crucifixion narrative do we read every Good Friday?
John,
Who are the bad guys, John?
the Jews.
The Jews. On what day of the year did the pogroms against the Jews typically happen in Eastern Europe? Probably Good Friday. Right, because the Christians would go to church, hear that story, and the Jews are the bad guys, and so they'd go out and kill some Jews. Happened all over Eastern Europe. So the root of European anti-Semitism is John's gospel. So knowing now what we know about the history, that is the argument for putting a late date on John's gospel, because it's post Council of Yavne, which was in 90 AD.
You say 90?
90, yeah, 90. Now, and that raises another set of issues that, again, he talks about, and I didn't really intend today to be entirely a lecture. So if you all have questions, feel free to ask them. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep babbling. One of the things that that Ehrman dances around, and I kept writing in the margins, why don't you just call it this? When he's talking about eschatology, what is that? Okay.
Instead of the end times.
Thank you. Thank you, Floyd. Yes, exactly. And there are, in the New Testament, there's the majority opinion, which is apocalyptic eschatology, and the minority opinion, which is reflected in John, which is called realized eschatology. And again, think about if Jesus' ministry is somewhere in the early decade of the 30s, and the Gospels aren't being written until the 70s, 80s, and 90s, how many decades is that? What is the average lifespan?
Not that long.
Not that long. That's right. And there's a fascinating book, which I have taught and may offer as a follow-up, written by the preeminent Roman Catholic Johannine scholar Ray Brown, called The Churches the Apostles Left Behind. And he really zeroes in on these decades when the last people who could have been alive to witness Jesus' ministry were beginning to pass away. And think about the crisis if, as reflected in Paul's letters, he expected the second coming any day now. So what happens when any day now turns into, well, another month and another month and another year and another decade, and everybody, I mean, he said there are some alive today who will see this happen And they're not alive anymore. They're all pushing up daisies.
Well, it's what happens most recently. What, the Mayan calendar was going to roll over and the world was going to end.
Oh, well, we thought that at Y2K.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Everything, this would go up in smoke and.
Yeah.
Billy Graham had that book in the eighties, beginning of the eighties called Armageddon, 1980s, Countdown to Armageddon.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
right.
That's sort of, and if you think he was big then, imagine in the year 999,
Yeah,
because it was supposed to be a millennium, right?
well, we don't understand the numerology.
Yeah, well, let's not even go there. At the roots of this Seventh-day Adventist religion. They all went up on a mountain and were expecting it to happen. And this is in the 1800s. And of course it didn't. And it still hasn't. So this problem
And there was
in,
the book, The Late Great State of California.
oh yeah, well, so this now, and this is what fascinates me as a psychologist, is this ain't a new idea.
Oh, no.
That the world is going to hell in a handbasket and we need some magical outside force that's going to rescue us from ourselves. It's universal because it's part of the way this thing is made. But in terms of Christian theology, and I think about this every time we're reciting the creed, and he will come again in power and glory to judge the earth. When? Damn it, it's been 2,000 years. What are we waiting for?
That's when you wheel out God's time.
Yeah, well, okay. So let me do a little history, and I don't know if you guys can see this. Okay, where does apocalyptic come from? And this gets into one of the differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees in Jesus' day, is that the Sadducees didn't believe this stuff. It's non-Mosaic. It is not in the Old Testament. The Pharisees accepted it. Why? Where does it really come from? And how does it get into Judaism?
A desire for justice.
Well, I'm talking history. That's theology. The history is, it goes back to Persian Zoroastrianism. So again, if you know your Old Testament history, who were the ones that conquered the southern kingdom of Judah? Hint, it was not the Persians.
Babylon.
The second Babylonian empire called the Chaldean Empire.
Okay.
Nebuchadnezzar, right? Okay. Now, who conquered the Chaldean Empire? This is, if you didn't take ancient history. In fact, I've got a patient who's a high school AP history teacher, and she said in the new curriculum, they don't go backward past 1200 AD.
Really?
That means we got a whole crop of high school students that don't know diddly squat about even the Roman Empire.
Yeah, well.
We didn't know much before then either.
Well, I took world history in high school. I was fascinated by it. All right, so in Zoroastrian thought, you have the present age, which is dominated by Ahriman. And there's going to be a showdown between the forces of Ahriman and Ahura Mazda. Okay? And that turning point is the day of, insert, judgment, the Lord, the coming of Messiah. So the Jews are exposed to this during the time when they are part of the Persian Empire, which is relatively long. It's a couple hundred years. Who conquers the Persian Empire, by the way? I couldn't hear you either.
Greeks.
Yes, Alexander. Alexander the Great. So Palestine is part of the Persian Empire for a couple hundred years. About as long as this country has existed, just to put that in perspective. And in fact, the only version of the Talmud that exists is the Babylonian Talmud. So there continued to be a large Jewish population that stayed in Mesopotamia. Long after, and this is the story in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, it's the Persian kings who allow the Jews to finally leave and go back to Jerusalem and start rebuilding the wall and eventually rebuild the temple. That's the temple that stood in Jesus' day, the one that the Romans knocked down. That's the so-called second temple, because the Chaldeans destroyed the one built by Solomon. Mike, you
How
got a
do
question?
the, all the prophetic prophecies about Messiah in the Old Testament?
Oh, that's the same Messiah. Doesn't say Messiah, it says suffering
Going back
servant.
into Genesis.
That's another whole class. Which,
So none of those prophetic things.
not
are about-
necessarily,
I mean, to stay, the Jews don't necessarily believe they are. But.
no,
I mean,
because the
when
word
I was a
Mashiach,
Jew, they just don't think it's just Jesus. These things-
actually, when I was newly ordained and assistant at the Church of Walnut Creek, I co-taught a class with the local rabbi, Gordon Freeman, and the class was called "Who is the Messiah?"
That would have been.
Would have been a class.
Yeah, and we taught it once at St. Paul's in Walnut Creek and once at the Jewish synagogue. So what does the Hebrew word Mashiach mean? Oilhead,
Right, the anointed one.
the anointed, which is curiously enough the same as the Greek word Christos.
We get Christ, right?
Right. Is the one who's been chrismated with oil of chrism. Okay, so now again, you have to put yourself back in time, about 2,500 years. And you're a Jew, and you used to have political autonomy. You used to have your own king, and you used to be able to do your own thing under your own king. That was kind of cute and unintentional. But now, ever since Nebuchadnezzar, the 6th century BC, you have been under somebody's thumb, right? First the Chaldeans, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and now the Romans. How's that working for you?
What's the total length of time roughly?
500 years, 500-600 years,
Okay.
with a brief, very brief period of independence. You know, the holiday of Hanukkah is told in the books of the Maccabees. Now, the irony is they still celebrate the holiday, even though they banned the books from their Bible in 90 AD, because they were written in Greek.
Why would we give up a party?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, so that story of the miraculous candles in the temple staying lit is in the period of the Wars of the Maccabees, and there was a period where the Ptolemaic Empire, one of the successors to Alexander, was weak enough that there was a nominal period of independence. And so the Maccabean Wars are the Jews against the, oh no, wait a minute. Ptolemies? No, the Seleucids. The Seleucid Empire was rooted in Syria. Ptolemies were Egypt. And Palestine went back and forth between the two, but they were both successor kingdoms from Alexander.
And that was a time right after, what was the guy that came and sat in the temple, the Antichrist guy that came and desecrated the temple.
Rode his horse up.
That was the Seleucid Empire.
Right.
Antiochus Epiphanes, the 4th?
Right, so it was not, right, that.
Yeah, 1st century BCE. Right. And so if you're a Jew and you're from this little podunk sort of backwater area, and you need some help, you need a strong ally to help you in your fight against these Seleucid Greeks, guess who you would invite in?
The Romans.
The Romans. And sort of like a comment that somebody made about Putin recently, once you invite them in, they tend to stay. And so that period of quasi-independence was very brief. And that's how the Romans ended up in Palestine. So now you have been exposed to this kind of a view of the world for 500 years. It's not hard to see how you would look at the present age as dominated by evil if you've been under some foreigner's thumb for, 500 years. What are you looking for?
Escape.
Escape, relief, salvation, the establishment of a righteous kingdom where God, your God, never mind everybody else's God, but our God, is finally going to get his due. We're finally going to realize that our God really is the only God that there really is, and he's in charge of everything, even though we've been getting our butts kicked for 500 years. So you can see the sort of cognitive dissonance that grows in your head?
Yeah.
Okay, our God is the king of the world, but it sure doesn't look like it when we've been taking orders from and paying taxes to some foreign emperor from somewhere. Just it depends on which century you're talking about. Doesn't matter, it's the same dynamic, right? So you get this kind of inferiority complex. So that gives rise to what is called the messianic hope. So we take these notions that are rooted in Zoroastrianism, we Judaize them. We look back in our own scriptural history and we seize on passages, say from Isaiah, about this suffering servant and about this future banquet that we're all going to enjoy and all this good stuff that is sometime, somehow, eventually going to come to God's faithful people. And we say, well, this is sounding better all the time. And so what gets taught in the synagogues, not at the temple in Jerusalem, but there are a whole lot more synagogues than there is one temple. So what the common folk all over the place, throughout, just think of the whole Eastern Mediterranean, because you have synagogues from Athens all the way around through what is now Turkey and all of what you and I call the Middle East, all the way down to Egypt. What they are looking for is salvation from a very real social political situation. It's got not much to do with theology. Yeah.
Weren't there many people who claimed to be the Messiah?
Oh, you're getting ahead of me. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, there were more than one.
Yeah, but I never hear about the details of that, just the rumor of it.
Yeah, Shimon Bar Kokhba was one of them. He's the second revolt in 125. So apocalyptic then becomes part and parcel because, again, so this messianic hope is when Messiah comes, things are going to be hunky-dory. So Jesus comes. Where's hunky-dory?
Army.
I mean, the Romans are still here. We still see centurions marking up and down the street. So what's going on here? There's a part of this that isn't measuring up. So if you're Paul, you're sure that it's coming any day now. And I'm going to tell you that it will happen before you are pushing up daisies. And that's fine, as long as you're not pushing up daisies. But if our children are hearing somebody like me say the same thing, and eventually they're putting you in the ground and you are pushing up daisies, the kids are going to start saying, I'm not sure if I should believe that Dave guy. I think maybe he was full of baloney. Either that, or We misunderstood something? Okay. So again, Paul's writing in the 40s, 50s. So that's within a generation. Late 60s, early 70s, you have this horrendous calamity. The Jews try to revolt against Rome. Rome puts it down with an. We remember somebody saying something about Jesus talking about when the temple's no more. Was he speaking symbolically about his own body, or did he really mean what we all just saw? Because the temple is no more. Surely that means it's going to happen, like right now. And then another decade goes by, and another decade goes by. More people are pushing up daisies. Even the apostles are pushing up daisies. What's taking so long? So this, and again, Ehrman never labels it as such, which is kind of astounding to me, because he talks all around it. The technical term for that problem is the delay of the parousia, P-A-R-O-U-S-I-A, which is Greek for second coming. And we see in Mark, there is some apocalyptic, not much, it's all concentrated in the 13th chapter. People think by the time Luke is writing, it's another 10, 15 years later. It still hasn't happened. So Luke modifies the notion, which is why he writes a sequel to his gospel called Acts. And his solution is that, well, God's giving us time to spread the gospel throughout the known world, so that we'll know who's on our side and who's not. So when the Messiah does come again, it'll be easier to tell the sheep from the goats.
There's a passage where the disciples are asking, when will your kingdom come? Right? And he goes, even I don't know. Maybe Father. Right?
Yeah,
So Jesus admits
that's a nice dodge. Remember, there's nothing that says Jesus said that.
But there's nothing.
The
that
author
says he
of
didn't
a-
say it either.
The author of a later gospel who's dealing with exactly this problem.
Right. Well,
Again, this is where you read an author and allow that author to speak for himself. Don't put other ideas into what may or not have been their head, because they're all dealing with this problem.
right, but that doesn't necessarily mean that was written late. It doesn't, we don't know that for sure.
I couldn't hear the
We
first
don't
part.
know that that was written later. It could have been something Jesus actually
Could have, he could have said any number of things,
said. Right.
but then you're just wildly speculating
Well,
to fit a preconceived theological assumption.
Well, we're all speculating on everything.
No, we're not, and that's his point. Some of this we know from textual evidence.
I don't know about that specific. I don't know how you can prove something.
Okay, well, maybe you and I can talk later.
Yeah.
We'd have to talk a lot of Greek.
His
Yeah.
is actually very good.
Well, yeah, he's,
But the reason is that the criteria of embarrassment,
I don't understand the phrase.
well, Jesus, when there's something said in the gospel that, and there are many, but Peter's inappropriate betrayal of Jesus, it has the resonance of fact, because the Christians wanted to put Christianity in the best possible light.
Oh, yeah, so why would you portray a negative
Right, and the same thing here.
rather than whitewash?
Right, and the same thing here about the divinity of Jesus and.
They're looking at my belly on screen. I don't know that that's my best view, but I want them to be able to see. I'm just noticing that. Sorry if you've been looking at my gut.
We didn't know.
You didn't, but they did.
But what Jesus said in that passage was, not even the Son knows. So the Christians are trying to heap divinity, and the gospel writers are trying to heap divinity on Jesus. And here they portray Jesus as saying, even I don't know.
Well,
That's embarrassing.
well, and that gets to another issue and a major difference between the synoptics and John's gospel, and that's
Yeah.
the Christology.
Yeah.
And I don't want to go there yet. I want to save that for later. And we're almost done. So let me just make this. Where was I going with that? Oh, the contrast between this eschatology and John's solution to the problem. And again, assuming that John is the latest, written somewhere in the 90s after the Council of Yavne, in which the split between Jews and Christians is formalized with the expulsion of Christians from synagogues throughout the world, is that John's solution is that all of this apocalyptic stuff is bunk. Jesus did come again. It's called Easter, and the kingdom is now. It's not going to be something that is out there imposed externally. It is an internal state of being, and as soon as you accept that Jesus is the Son of God, you're in the kingdom, whether it outwardly looks like it or not. That is labeled realized eschatology, as distinct from apocalyptic eschatology. And it is the minority opinion. It has never been a mainstay of Christian theology because the Nicene Creed enshrines apocalyptic, but that was written 400 years later. As a result of other controversies that we can talk about, we will get into later when we start talking about other books that we know existed, but were not included in the New Testament, and why, and who were their authors, and what was their theology, and why did they not make the cut? Okay, with that, we got to stop.
I
felt like this was
one thing
more-
really quickly.
Yeah.
I sat through in my lifetime a lot of these discussions. It's always about time. I don't think we understand. time.
That could be.
And a lot of this stuff, I mean, I've read it over the years, so much of this kind of stuff, and it all, it's great education. There's lots of wonderful stuff. It's very fascinating, it really is, 'cause if you love history especially.
Mhm.
But what comes down to, not just with this, but with most subjects, even science, it's our best educated guesses, and even the most educated differ on our best educated differences. So it all comes down to what the Bible's all about, faith. It really does come back to faith.
We'll get back to that.
Yeah.
Because you're right, because that's kind of the point of the last chapter of the book. On what does our faith really rest?
Right. We are.
And how that changed from a verb to a noun. Faithing versus as an action versus the faith. Content, like the creed. Okay, with that, gotta quit. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, David.
See you next week.
Righty.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for
Have a
joining
good
us.
week.
You too.